Welcome back, and today we are talking about deepening one's perspective on the world. And so in this chapter we have a collection of different sutras that begins to dig a little bit more into some of the things going on in the world, both for lay practitioners as well as for monastics, although I would say most of the things in here tend to be more directed towards lay practitioners than monks and nuns, although there are exceptions to that as well. So it becomes one of the things that has information that's really helpful for us because it's particularly relevant in a lot of cases. So at the beginning of the introduction, it says, in interpreting sutras, we have to take account of the circumstances under which they were spoken and the persons to whom they were addressed. And that's a little bit what we were just talking about there. And then the Buddha taught those not yet ripe enough for higher attainments to aspire for rebirth among the devas and to enjoy the bliss and glory of the heavens. So there is this difference between lay practitioners for whom he was teaching, well, if you can just have a good life, you do good things, and you'll have a good rebirth, either as a human again or in one of the God realms. And there were lots of God realms, as we have seen. And then in the second paragraph he says, however, this is not the final purpose for which the Buddha taught Dharma. Only a temporary way station. The ultimate goal is the cessation of suffering. Thus, the ultimate aim is nothing short of liberation. So some of the teachings do seem to be divided at different levels here, but ultimately he wants everybody to achieve liberation. In the next paragraph, this is called nirvana. Nirvana transcends the conditioned world, yet it can be attained within conditioned existence in this very life and experienced as an extinction of suffering. And that's the way that initially he defined nirvana. Now he also included other descriptors here and there as a part of it, but basically getting rid of the three poisons. So we snuff out those three fires, and when that is done, we achieve nirvana, so to speak. A few lines down, the realization of nirvana comes with the blossoming of wisdom and brings perfect peace. So here are some other alternative terms. Perfect peace, untarnished happiness, and the stilling of the mind's compulsive drives. Nirvana is the destruction of thirst, the thirst of craving. It is the island of safety amid the raging currents of old age, sickness, and death. So that is a helpful list to look at because it gives us kind of the essence of what the Buddha is talking about when he talks about nirvana. Those are terms that pop up over and over again in different places, sometimes collected together like that was, other times kind of interspersed here and there. So on page 184, the Buddha had to steer them beyond the blissful rewards through the world transcending facets of his teaching. So the ordinary kinds of experiences that we have are good, but that's not enough. We need to push beyond that limit to the more transcendent form. What in here he translates as world transcending. And so the dangers inherent in all of these conditioned states of being are perilous and fraught with pain. The one hope of lasting security lies with complete purification and liberation of the mind. So we often talk about Buddhism as training the mind. So that's really what we are trying to do here, and all of these teachings are trying to help us with that process. He presented a path that cuts through ignorance and craving and dispels attachment even to the most refined states of meditative absorption. So one of the problems we can encounter is, well, this feels really good when I meditate. And so then we get attached to that feeling and we want to recreate it the next time we sit on the cushion. So we need to be very careful about those kind of things. It's a very common kind of problem. And so in the next paragraph, to introduce newcomers, the Buddha taught regularly. His teaching began regularly by discussing such practices as giving and moral discipline, the first two of the six perfections. And so that generosity and ethics and so forth. He would extol the beauty of such virtues as generosity, harmlessness, honesty, and self-restraint, explaining how such meritorious deeds lead to the joys of a heavenly rebirth. And so again, he's talking about this in what we would refer to as a relative sense. At this point, he would reveal the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures and the blessings of renunciation. Having thus ripened the minds of his audience, he would next expound on the Four Noble Truths, suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. And then, to awaken in them the vision of the Dharma, the first direct realization of transcendent truth. So he sets them up by talking about these relative benefits and then pushes beyond that and says, but wait, there's more. And so he goes on into the world transcending aspects of this. And then in the last paragraph, sometimes in the sutras, disciples attain their first experience of awakening merely by listening to the Buddha. But at the bottom, but by its very nature, the world transcending Dharma goes against the grain of the mundane mind. The Buddha describes the Dharma as subtle, deep, and difficult to see. So it's not always real obvious sometimes what he's talking about or how we achieve what he's talking about. But he gives lots of different teachings and bring those things together in ways that help us. And then there are also lots of commentaries that help guide us, although, as we learned earlier, some of those commentaries kind of diverge from one another. And so then we get different lineages and so forth in the tradition, trying to all be helpful, but in some cases maybe not being quite so helpful. On the top of page 185, its thesis that the highest happiness cannot be won by yielding to the longings of the heart, but only by subduing them, runs utterly counter to the thought, attitudes, and actions of people fully immersed in the world. So this is a very different path. If you're totally wrapped up in the world, this can seem rather strange. If you are so involved in the movie you're watching that you jump when something happens, if you, the tears are flowing, and that happens to me sometimes, I confess. Other kinds of things, when you really get engrossed in it rather than just watching it as a movie, that's the same thing that happens in life. If we're really engrossed in life, we have the same kind of problem. If we step back from it a little bit and watch it like a movie, then we can make better decisions about the appropriate things to do. So, let's see. As long as we are infatuated with the seductive lures of sensual enjoyment, delight in being this or becoming that, we will regard the sublime Dharma as a mystery and a puzzle. And the Buddha therefore realized that the first major challenge was to break the grip on sensual pleasure and worldly attachment that what they have on the mind. He had to steer disciples away from the lures of sensuality and worldly attachment and guide them toward disenchantment and complete dispassion and awakening. So you start to get a sense of where some of those teachings come from that we do talk about a lot when we begin seeing how this gets put together in the Buddha's teachings. In the next paragraph down a few lines, he had to speak up frankly and candidly, even when candor bred resentment. Enter the fray of debate, use similes, metaphors, and parables, and uphold his principles strongly. The Buddha exceeded very well in doing these kinds of things. So he was very astute. He was a bright guy, and he knew how to use language. He knew how to use stories and similes and all of those kind of things to get his point across. In my teachings on leadership, one of the things, in fact, I used to use a book. We focused on one book in particular that talks specifically about how to use language as a leader. In a way to be more effective in communicating and convincing people to go along with a vision that you had and so forth. So those are all important kind of things to be aware of not only for leaders, but for all of us, and for the Buddha as a leader of this organization. And so those are key things, and he seems to have had a very good grasp on those kind of things. Then we get into the individual texts here, a brief synopsis of each of those. And so the first one is VI 1, or 6.1. The Buddha's task is to impart to us a radically new education in the art of seeing. I like that term. We have to learn to see beneath the surface glitter of pleasure, position, and power that usually enthralls us, to learn to see through the deceptive distortions of perception, thought, and views that habitually cloak our vision. These biases are shaped by our craving and attachments, which they in turn reinforce. We see things we want to see, blot out things that threaten or disturb us. And we see that all the time. Things going on right now, and how we tend to look at things on the internet. We like the things that we like, and we dislike the things we dislike, and it just becomes more and more exaggerated because we're not willing to even consider the point of view of the other side. To undo this involves a commitment to truth that is often unsettling, but in the long run proves exhilarating and liberating, and brings about a deepening of our perspective on the world. So then he goes on in the next text, actually a group of texts here, to talk about what he refers to, Bhikkhu Bodi refers to as the three moments, or whatever the words were that the Buddha may have used for those, or three steps. They are gratification, danger, and escape. And so these then are applied to the world as a whole, and then applied more specifically to 4 material elements, 5 aggregates, and 6 internal and external sense bases. So the Buddha makes the bold pronouncement that until he was able to fully evaluate the world, the elements, aggregates, sense bases, and so forth, in this way he did not claim that he had attained the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. So as a bodhisattva, he hadn't evaluated all of those factors, and so until he did that, he wasn't actually fully enlightened. So one begins by recognizing that such worldly phenomena give us a degree of gratification, pleasure, and joy. When we succeed in fulfilling our desires, we can then probe deeper by asking whether such pleasure and joy are entirely satisfactory. And we've talked about that in other contexts. The psychologists talk about this, that there are those kind of things that affect us on a short-term basis. They usually come from outside of us and so forth, and we get joy and pleasure from those things. But they don't last, and so we want more and more and more. So we get on what they refer to as the hedonic treadmill, continuously trying to get more of that. And then there's another form of that where they come usually from inside of us, and they last much longer. And so that's part of what we're trying to do with Buddhism, is reach those internal approaches that are more lasting and are more beneficial to us in the long run. So when we realize that these pleasures and joys are far from satisfactory, and they are also saddled with various drawbacks and defects that we perpetually hide from ourselves, so this is their danger. So that's the second moment, or second step in the process. The most pervasive danger is their inherent nature of being impermanent and bound up with suffering or discontent, and subject to inevitable change and decay. So the third moment is the moment of escape, or the third step is the escape here. And the most rational, most judicious course of action when we recognize a genuine danger is our search for an exit. How do we get out of this? So once we see that the objects of our attachment are flawed, beset with different dangers, then we realize that the way of escape lies in dropping our attachment to them. So if we just let go of these things, then we're no longer bound up by them. the removal of desire and lust, the abandoning of desire and lust. The Pali commentators connect these three to the Four Noble Truths. So gratification is the second noble truth, for pleasure and joy arouse craving, the origin of suffering. Danger is the truth of suffering in itself, and escape is the truth of the cessation of suffering, which also implies the Noble Eightfold Path, the fourth truth. So the way to cessation of suffering. So all of those are inferred, at least, or connected in some ways with the Four Noble Truths. The next text, VI 3, the Buddha uses this threefold scheme to make a detailed appraisal of three major objects of attachment: sensual pleasures, bodily form, and feelings. So for the first one, it talks about the dangers of sensual pleasures. And one of the things we have to keep in mind as we look at these things is that oftentimes he's not just talking about moderate versions of sensual pleasures, but he's talking about extreme versions, really, really strong kinds of attachment and so forth. So be careful about exaggerating, if you will, what it is that he is concerned about. A young householder pursuing a professional career might undergo in his quest for sensual gratification. The scope widens from personal to the collective, the broader social and political consequences. It reaches a climax, striking images of warfare and human devastation. Form is the physical body. Consider a beautiful girl, then the progressive stages of her physical decay through old age, sickness, death, and the eventual disintegration of the corpse. And then to show the danger in feeling, the Buddha selects the feelings of meditating monk in the jhanas. The most refined fundamental experiences of pleasure and peace. Even these are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change. The following text's emphasis falls on the aspect of danger, and there are two here that are referred to. There's the accent on the pitfalls of sensual pleasures, and that was referred to a little bit differently than in the preceding section. And then 641 is about the pompous householder who imagines that he has cut off all worldly affairs. And then the Buddha uses a series of similes that expose the deceptiveness of the sensual pleasures to show him what cutting off of affairs means in his own system of training. So he thought that he had cut them off, but in reality he had only kind of hidden them away a little bit. Okay. Then in VI 4.2, he pits the Buddha against the hedonist named Magandiya, I guess. The Buddha, and the sensual pleasures seem to be pleasurable only through distortion of perception, but seen rightly are like the fire in a pit, charcoal pit, the painful to the touch, hot and scorching. This passage includes some of the most powerful similes in the Nikayas. And then VI 5, we have the use of imagery whose theme is the transience of human life, the certainty of death and the uncertainty of the time of its arrival, to help us break our infatuation with life and develop detachment from that. So that goes against the grain a little bit in the Western tradition, where we tend to like life and the things about it. You can go to the self-help section of any bookstore, you can find all kinds of ways to help make this life a whole lot better. Well, we can make it better, but in different ways as well. We don't have to buy into the idea that the person who dies with the most toys wins. And so that's part of what he's trying to help us with here. In text VI 6, they have an excerpt from the Ratapala Sutta. The disciple of the Buddha Ratapala was a young man from a well-established family who decided to embrace the homeless life of a monk. The Buddha asked him to obtain his parents' permission, but his parents adamantly refused. So Ratapala thereupon lay down and refused to eat or drink, determined to die right there. His parents relented on the condition that he would later return to visit them. Years later, when he visited, his parents tried to entice him back. But since he had already attained arhatship, he was now beyond any possibility of disrobing. He went to the royal pleasure garden, where he gave a discourse to King Kauravya on 4 summaries of the Dharma. And this discourse conveys his profound insights into the depth and universality of suffering. So here we have an arhat giving a sutra as opposed to the Buddha himself doing that. And so there are certain cases where it's some of his disciples that are actually the one giving the teaching or discourse, and not always directly from the Buddha. And then craving for sensual pleasures is one trap. Another is attachment to views. Thus the Buddha not only had to dispel infatuation with sensual pleasures, but also the danger of views. And the most dangerous of wrong views are those that deny or undermine the foundations of ethics. And so ethics are extremely important as a foundation of all of Buddhism. And so it's very important that we understand that. And so, for example, when we go through the mind training, which includes ethics, meditation, and wisdom, ethics comes first. And in the teachings that he had, at that time, the teachers always started with ethics. So there may have been a couple of preliminaries to that, but ethics was the first significant part of the teachings. And so it's very, very important. And then in VI 7.1, the perils posed by rebirth in the lower realms also lead to one-sided, biased interpretations of reality. So the views thus give rise to conflicts and disputes. And here we have then the famous parable of the blind men and the elephant, one of those that almost everybody really likes, in text VI 7.2. And then in VI 7.3, we have a contrast between distorted views known as eternalism and annihilism, so-called existence and non-existence. Eternalism affirms the eternal component in an individual, an indestructible self or soul, and an eternal ground of the world, such as the all-powerful Creator God. Where annihilism denies that there is such a survival beyond death, there is a complete end. So eternalism leads to delight in existence and binds beings to a cycle of existence. Annihilism is often accompanied by disgust with existence that binds adherents to the same existence that they loathe. And so the Buddha's teaching here is on dependent origination that avoids both of those. In text VI 8, he highlights the particular problem posed by the eternalist views. Such views can inspire meditators to attain states of deep meditative bliss, which they interpret as union with the divine reality or realization of an eternal self. However, such attainments merely create a karmic potential for rebirth into a realm in which the meditative experience becomes the fundamental condition of consciousness. So you work on this particular practice of meditation at a particular level, but that's also the highest level that you can go to in any kind of a rebirth in the various realms. And these are usually identified as being a part of one of the God realms. So there's a realm of subtle form and the formless realms. Usually we talk about the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And so the form and the formless realms are all God realms, and there's various subcategories within those. And then the desire realm is the realm that we are in, but within that there are 6 parts, the top 2 of which, just above us, is the jealous God realm and the God realm. So even in the desire realm, there are two God realms, and then in some cases it's described as being even more than that. So those are the realms that we're talking about here. So the Buddhist teaching holds that these worlds hold no final outlet from impermanence and misery of samsara. Then certain meditators attain the four divine abodes, those would be the four immeasurables, and take rebirth in the corresponding planes of the Brahma world. Eventually they pass away and may fall into unfortunate realms of rebirth. And in the final section, it takes up the unsatisfactoriness and insecurity of conditioned existence. So in VI 9.1, the Buddha declares that the amount of tears we have shed while wandering through rebirth is greater than the water in the four great oceans. And in 9.2, he tells a group of monks that the amount of blood that they have shed when they were slaughtered and in various rebirths is greater than the water in the four great oceans also. According to the compilers of the sutra, the impact of this discourse upon the 30 monks was so powerful that they attained full liberation on the spot. So, we'll take a short break.